So I've got your Tuesday story today, and again taking it from our book about rescues. So this story today is about a person called Anupam Gaur, and it's about a helicopter in the Himalayas, and it happened in India in 2007. An Italian holds the record for the highest ever helicopter rescue at 7,800 metres, or nearly 5 miles above sea level. But one of the most heroic and remarkable feats of mountain flying was carried out in the Himalayan mountains by a colonel in the Indian Army. In 2007, Anupam Gaur was stationed on the Sichuan Glacier, which straddles the borders of India, China and Pakistan. The glacier is part of the gigantic ice field covering more than 250 square miles. As a helicopter pilot in the Army's Aviation Corps, Anupam's job was to fly supplies into the region as well as looking out for any mountaineers, military or civilian, who were in trouble. As a young man, he had spent a lot of time on the glacier, and he had trained there when he first joined the army. The thin mountain air meant it could sometimes be hard to breathe, and temperatures frequently dropped to 50 degrees below freezing. But as a keen pilot, Anupam enjoyed the challenges of working in such an extreme environment. He and a group of other pilots ate and slept in a cluster of small fiberglass huts, but none of them seemed to mind the discomfort. In September, a team of experienced, well-equipped mountaineers passed by the huts. 11 of them were on their way to climb Remo, one of India's highest peaks, at 7,385 metres. One of the pilots advised them to call off the expedition. Remo was an exceptionally tough climb at any time of the year, even for experts, and all the pilots knew that the weather forecast for the next few weeks was not good. The mountaineers had been planning their trip for a while, so they decided to go on anyway. It was several days before anyone in the huts began to wonder how they had got on. It was worrying that nobody had seen anyone coming back down the mountain, and after 10 days there was still no sign of them. Anupam was sitting in his hut when he received a call on his satellite telephone, a special model designed to work in very remote areas. The caller was one of the mountaineers, who said his group had run into trouble. During the final section of the climb, as they were nearing the peak, a rope had snapped, causing everyone to fall back down a steep slope. 3 of them had been injured in the fall, and the rest of the group were now in a bad way. They had run out of food, and their emergency telephone was almost out of batteries. "If you don't come soon," the exhausted mountaineer told Anupam, "we will all die here." It was clear that the mountaineers needed to be evacuated immediately, and as soon as the pilots had permission from their senior officers, they loaded supplies of food and water into their helicopters. Several of them took off, but the weather was already turning bad. Visibility was poor due to the snow, and the sheer size of the mountain made things even worse. Remo has 6 separate peaks, and even though the pilots knew the area well, it took more than an hour to spot the mountaineers, huddled together at nearly 5,800 metres. The deep snow at this height meant it was impossible to land, so the pilots decided to drop parcels of food as close as possible to the stranded climbers. Unfortunately, most of the packets sank into the snow and were lost. After seeing the mountaineers, Anupam and his colleagues realised how serious their injuries were. The men would still be in trouble even if they were able to eat something and get their strength back. One of them had a broken shoulder, and 2 more were so badly frostbitten that they couldn't walk, let alone climb down a mountain. Because the helicopters couldn't find anywhere safe to land, the pilots had to fly back to their base, which meant the mountaineers would have to spend another day and night in the freezing conditions. Anupam hoped that it would be possible for him to try another rescue the following morning. Unfortunately, the next day the weather was even worse. More snow had fallen overnight, and the helicopter's rotor blades kicked this up in clouds, making it even harder for any of the pilots to see what they were doing. However, Anupam knew that they had no choice but to try again. Time was running out for the mountaineers, and without the army's help, they would almost certainly perish. He decided to fly back up the mountain, but this time with much less fuel. This would limit the amount of time he could stay airborne, but by reducing the weight of the helicopter, it might be easier to control it in the very thin atmosphere. Anupam's plan was to fly as close as he could to the mountain. If he could hover just a few centimetres above the ground, his co-pilot might be able to pull the injured men into the helicopter. They could then be flown back down to the camp and taken to hospital. It was a daring plan and highly dangerous, but it might just work. Flying a helicopter really close to the ground takes enormous skill, even on flat land and in perfect weather. Thousands of metres up a mountain with snow blowing and high winds, it would be a demanding challenge even for a pilot as skilled and as experienced as Anupam Gaur. Carrying just enough fuel for the journey up to the injured men and back again, Anupam took off. When he spotted the climbers, he carefully manoeuvred his helicopter so that it was almost touching the ground. Hovering is much harder than it looks, but he managed to do it so precisely that one of the helicopter's skis actually rested on top of the snow. The other ski had to be kept airborne in order to prevent the heavy machine sinking into the snow. Anupam managed to hold his position for long enough for the first of the mountaineers to scramble aboard. His plan was working. The others followed, but it took time because the more seriously injured ones needed a lot of help from the co-pilot. Anupam meanwhile had to struggle with his controls. It was very important to keep the helicopter steady as its weight increased with each new passenger coming on board. He also had to make sure he didn't use up all of his fuel. Eventually, all 11 mountaineers were taken off the mountain. With the fuel close to running out, Anupam was able to bring the whole group down safely. Several of them needed time in hospital, and a few fingers were lost to frostbite. But Anupam Gaur had managed to rescue the injured climbers and all of their colleagues. Again, an illustration here of how he managed to hover the helicopter just above the ground to rescue the mountaineers.